To get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Aisha Armstrong, and earlier this year I started working with the Mesh Intelligence team, and I bring about 20 years of product design experience building data products and services. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the webinar today with Ben England of Ben England and Associates and FDAImports, and also Shub Debgupta of Mesh Intelligence. Just a quick note regarding the format of the meeting. Everyone is on mute again, but we do want this to be interactive. So please chat in your questions, your suggestions, and we'll share those as we go along. We also have some polling built in to help you do some real-time benchmarking, and we will reserve hopefully a few minutes at the end to do some open Q&A with Shub and with Ben. So let me give you a brief intro. If you don't know Shub or Ben, I'd like to introduce both of them. So Ben England is an attorney and the founder and CEO of Ben England and Associates, as well as FDAImports.com. He's a 17-year veteran of the FDA, where he served as regulatory counsel to the Associate Commissioner for Regulatory Affairs. And before that, he was an FDA Consumer Safety Officer and Compliance Officer. So really happy to have him with us today. And then Shub Debgupta is the founder and CEO of Mesh Intelligence, which is an advanced data and analytics company that helps food organizations predict, plan, manage, and avoid costly food safety and supply chain disruptions. Mesh uses artificial intelligence, deep analytics, and a proprietary supply chain database to give organizations advance warning and tools to help you address issues in time and lower costs. Shub's work on Mesh was recently featured in the New York Times, NPR, and NBC News, and he's previously worked at CEB, now Gartner, Credit Suisse, and Wiser Together, where he was selected as the Innovator of the Year, and he has a PhD in economics from Cornell University. And with that, I will pass it over to Shub to get us started. I think we got to unmute. There we go.
Yes, there you go. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Aisha, and really glad to be here. And thank you for joining us. We're calling in from a rainy Washington, D.C. The topic du jour, the COVID-19, is really the latest issue to disrupt our supply chains. And it's forcing food and device organizations to really take action. But when you look at it, when you look at the disruptions that it's causing, we see that the number of them, logistics bottlenecks, here shown on the left-hand side, labor shortages, restricted movements, are things that we as organizations have actually faced in the past. In fact, we, over the past few years, every one of you has faced adverse events, including food and safety issues, food safety issues, med device safety issues, border issues and import delays, natural disasters, God forbid, environmental disasters, but definitely economic issues around price changes, bankruptcies, political upheavals from your supply chain and regions that you source from, and labor disruption. In fact, Gartner in a recent survey found that almost 90%, so almost everyone has faced supply chain disruption in the past 5 years. And that's, each one individually is really hard. And when you think about why this actually happens repeatedly and increasingly more so, the answer really lies in our concentration of our supply chain. So moving to the next slide. In fact, if you look at both food and you look at devices in pharma, 10 countries supply almost 70% of our food and equal number for our med devices. That's a huge amount of concentration. So if you're working in food or across both markets, you're seeing certain countries have a disproportionate impact. Changes there, issues there, maybe there's labor movement issues or disruptions in each of those countries could have a significant impact, not just for you, but also a large number of your peer organizations sourcing from the same place. This level of concentration adds a tremendous amount of risk for us. And this shows up repeatedly. Looking at the next page. When you do an analysis of the different issues and disruptions that happen in our supply chain, you find, and this is a postmortem done of 120 different product recalls done by the GMA. So it's a little, so it gives you a sense of a deep dive. But we found that the supply chain issues break down into 4 real buckets: supply issue, regulation issue, transportation issue, geographic issue. Each one of these, handling each one and dealing with each one is really hard by itself. But when they start happening together, that's when you really get into trouble. And we see that increasingly in the next page. More and more of our supply chain issues are happening in combination with each other. They're related. There's this recent study done by the consulting firm Egon Zehnder that asked supply chain executives, what is their number one concern? Is that they said that they're feeling they have to deal with multiple issues at the same time. So this is a real challenge that we have to face. And it's really come to bear now in the COVID-19 time, when we're really facing a whole bunch of the supply chain disruptions all together at the same time. And with that, let me turn it over to Ben to give some color from the front line of dealing and helping with companies. Ben?
Great, thank you very much, Shub. I appreciate it. It's good to see everybody here today. It's a great and important topic. This slide is obviously designed to demonstrate some of the issues and some of the concerns. It's not, of course, only in food. It's not only in medical devices. It's in many other products, and that's largely because there's only so many channels. There's only so many ships. There's only so many containers. And when you have the bottlenecks and the backups that you have in these ports, in these countries where the sources are so concentrated, it actually affects everybody. It starts to bleed over into other industries, including whether they're in the medical space or the food space or textiles, really anywhere. So you see it in the headlines primarily, though, in context of important essential businesses, which are attempting to either make certain that you have basic supply chains for basic needs in the community, but also then medical products that are necessary in order to combat COVID directly. I think that I've been working with, because of our client base, we have clients in all of these industries and have for years, and consequently, they've brought to us stories that are, quite frankly, if I had hair, they would be hair raising. But without question, concerns about whether they're in need in order to try to make spot purchases for materials that they need desperately, either to supply a hospital or even to supply their ordinary normal supply chains, because the supply chains they usually rely on are backed up or unable to produce, or cargo is being backed up by customs in the country of export, because customs is worried about products leaving that in fact meet either U.S. or European requirements, and the lines are just getting longer and longer for products that are not even covered by those restrictions. So with spot purchasing, you immediately are running into supplier vetting. Can I trust this company? How do I know who the company is? How do I figure out whether they're capable of even supplying the demand that I have, much less the rest of the market has? How far over capacity are they already in their demand? These are all questions that go really across all the supply chains and the central industries, but because of the visibility we have, we see it a lot in the device in the food space, and so we thought it would be wise to use those as really examples of the way that that data can be used in order to identify, predict, do a better job of vetting, and then have a better success rate with respect to delivery. Let's go to the next slide. So what's the problem? The problem is, when I was at the FDA had the same problem. It was always, sorry, I had no idea my phone was on loud. We had the same problem at the FDA, and that was that the FDA, along with most of industry, is looking backwards. They're looking in the rearview mirror in order to determine what happened, rather than looking for ways to look forward ahead of them to determine what might happen. And that's really the difference. The difference is that rather than being reactive and looking backwards, we need to have data that enables us to be able to look forward and give some idea whether there's going to be risks that arise that's available to us. We can actually see it in the data if you have the tools in order to actually break that data out, analyze it, and see the patterns. The second major point is the risk assessments themselves are disaggregated. They're broken into their own silos. This is true with respect to not just audits, but really most of the risk assessment that's done in the industry. You don't ordinarily have a single view into how those risks interrelate. There's limited insight into tier 2 and tier 3 supplier risks. That is, how can you see past the person you're talking to? How can you see what information is available in order to determine whether across the supply chains you're capable of seeing that the raw material is in fact available to produce the material that you're attempting to purchase. Most of the safety monitoring approaches are not easy to scale. They're difficult to actually scale up. It's hard to cross over commodities. Once you've developed a risk model for a commodity, can you in fact use the same model when you go to a different commodity? It's often too slow. You're not able to see what's happening fast enough, and which makes it difficult for you to compete. But it's also too narrow. Most of the data that companies use that I see, they're looking at their supply chain, which they should be doing. But it turns out that their supply chain is really just a sliver of the data that's available in order to determine how your supply chain is doing, not only in comparison with others, but in the context generally of the industry. Whether it's behind your suppliers and it's upstream, or it's across markets, it's across geographical regions. And so most of what we do tends to be very, very narrow, very, very focused, reactive, looking backwards without much aggregation. Let's go to the next slide. So what kinds of questions need to be asked when you're in an environment where everything is at the speed of COVID, right? It's way faster than it was a month and a half ago. The exceptions are increasing dramatically. You're running into more problems in more places in your supply chain, as well as across your suppliers themselves. Whether it's because the suppliers are in a country where they're in lockdown and they're not able to produce, or they're not able to reliably deliver material, or there are restrictions that are being placed on the export of certain material for purposes that have to do with internal policy reasons by the government of that country. All of these issues, whether they're supplier or regulatory issues, transportation issues, and geographic issues, are all the kinds of questions that people should be asking when they're trying to make an assessment about whether there is risk associated with taking a particular action. I don't want to go through all of them. We're actually going to see this slide again, so let's go to the next slide. So the need here, in our view, and this is something that FDA went to with the PREDICT system primarily. The whole concept with PREDICT was to be able to use data that's in the supply chain. It's a high velocity data source. It's highly varied. You have positive and negative outputs that come from various activities that the agency would conduct with respect to imported cargo, to take that data and evaluate it in order to attempt to predict the supply chains where there's likely to be more risk. From FDA's perspective, they're doing it primarily to determine likely violations, the likelihood of there being, and of course the agency would focus on safety related issues or efficacy to the extent that has to do with drugs or devices. But still, it was not uncommon that the agency, when they were using a predictive tool, FDA found that ordinarily they had a significantly higher hit rate when they went to examine cargo that was scored higher using a predict-like model. And the concepts of predict are really just the same concepts that are available to all industry, provided you have access to the applicable data in order to assess it in the context of your own supply chain. Let's go to the next slide. I think this is you, Shub, right?
Yep, this is me. So that's exactly what we're building. So we've been putting together a very unique data asset to answer those questions from a couple pages ago, where Ben listed all the different questions that you, as organizations, typically look to answer about the risk in your supply chains. Those questions are answerable. And we've done that, and we can answer that with external data. So here we've bucketed a bunch of different data sources. This data has been collected, curated, cleaned, connected now for many, many years, and all the way from regulatory data. And regulatory data is really interesting because every time a product crosses a border, a national border, information is captured and released, and that is very valuable. So every transaction, so we remembered $225 billion worth of medical devices in pharma, $175 billion worth of food crosses the border every year. And there is a tremendous amount of information about the products that go through that. 400 million products that come through since 2002. Geographically, each border, which border it crosses also matters. As you said, 10 different countries are highly concentrated, but where are they sourcing from? We talk about devices, we talk about food. Are they coming from India, going to China, packaged and then sent to the US? All those matter. When you think about risk in your supply chain, level 1, level 2, and beyond, you're really trying to understand and trace that path. Data allows you to do so. The supplier themselves, every company, and you have a direct relationship with your suppliers, you're able to understand some information, what they will share to you only. But there is a lot of information that is embedded in their context. Their financials, employment history, certifications, which is a big deal and a big focus for us. But beyond that, who are they working with? What is their volume? What are their manufacturing locations? There's a tremendous amount of information that can be captured and garnered and giving you a risk assessment of the suppliers. In addition, how things move to you, weather, climate, environmental issues, all matter depending on the specific product. So if you're in dairy, for example, temperatures and precipitation have a huge impact on the risk of your product. Food safety, but also if there's disruptions along the way, port delays, road traffic, transit, all those matter. Transportation is really interesting because you could see preferred routes and typical routes of different organizations. Now imagine if you can track that and see where along the way the typical breakdowns do happen, and this becomes really valuable. So putting this data set together is no trivial task, but once you do have it, it becomes extremely powerful. It gives you the eyes on the ground you need to see where your product starts and how it gets to you. And all this can be done with external data. We're not asking, you don't need to get key data from the organizations themselves, suppliers, because that has been really hard and challenging. So you can actually collect that data and manage and monitor, and then more importantly, predict what to do. Move to the next slide. So just very quickly, this is really tying back to the slide Ben had mentioned a few slides ago. We can answer using this external data set. We can currently answer these questions and help you assess and understand your risk very quickly. So move to the next page. So what does Mesh do? So working with Ben England's team at FDAImports, we are able to help you we have built a proactive approach to really identify your risk in your suppliers and your shipments in advance of them happening and help you take measures. And this is really important because that in advance is really all that is extremely important. It gives you that advantage you need to take action. So knowing that something goes wrong along with everybody else brings us to the situation we're facing in COVID, where everybody's scrambling at the same time, driving up prices, going after limited supply and production supply all over the world. And that's really hard. And you don't want to face that situation again. So getting that advance notice a month, 2 months, 3 months in advance allows you to plan, understand whether that's an issue, and then act on it. And this is the solution that we're designing. Starting with a threat alert, understanding and monitoring your feeds to understand where the alert is and where the issue is, prioritizing it to saying whether that is an issue that you have to act now or you can watch it and monitor it later. And once it is prioritized, scenario planning, understanding what the implications are, who you need to work with, what you need to do, how do you solve for that problem, and then how do you ensure that you never have to face that again. That's what we are able to do with the data. So moving to the next page, and that allows you that gives you that advantage to work no matter what your path is, whether you're working with an existing vendor, you want to work with somebody that you currently have vetted and you're working with to help them build inventory or find alternative routes or help you with a different recipe or source different products. Working with the existing vendor, what do you do? How do you bring that up in advance and start that conversation with them? It's based on data and facts. And then alternatively, or maybe in addition, you want a backup plan, you want to work with a new vendor. How do you vet and source a new vendor? Somebody who's already approved, somebody who's already gone through this process, somebody who can handle your demand and your requests. How do you do that quickly? Those number of different questions that Ben had raised, those take months typically. How do you get to that quickly? Move to the next page. So this is what our proposed solution is looking to do. It's three parts to it. One is to predict the risk, build predictive risk alerts for you. So really using advanced analytics to help you understand risks. The second one is once you have a risk, how do you plan and prioritize action? Because not all risks are the same, and you don't need to act the same way for each risk. So depending on the risk it is, whether it's in the supplier themselves or en route or the supplier's suppliers will have impact on your response. Planning and prioritize action is number two. And the third piece is if you have to go and source the product from somewhere else, how do you source smartly? Typical sourcing takes a long time and involves a number of different parties, especially when it's all over the world. How do you source smartly, and how do you vet the supplier to make sure that they're able to supply to you? These three steps are possible with our data, and I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking this. On the previous page, yes. As I go through this, this is a solution that we have the data to build, and we are building currently. It's extremely important, given the time we live in, that we want everyone to weigh in and tell us what is really important to them. Not just what was nice to have, but really what is most important to you. And as we think through and make decisions of what to prioritize now versus others, we are trying to unpack that and collect that information from clients, possible clients, and possible users. And so let's take the first one. Here, Aisha mentioned, and we urge you to use the chat feature to tell us how this would, which parts of these features would be interesting to you, and we can obviously go deeper as needed. So the first part, it all starts with that alert. Without the alert, you're really stuck in the water with everybody else. Understanding in advance where your risk is and what your risk is. So here we are proposing to really help you understand your upcoming risk in advance, and very importantly, to be able to isolate the risk and understand its impact. A risk, as I mentioned, inside your supplier, because they are struggling with their suppliers, is very different from a risk which is in your in the transportation or a route, driven by a port delay or a labor movement or logistics issues. How you respond matter. When they're happening together, it's a different story. So really understanding the risk itself, and then will allow you to develop a scenario plan and a plan of action. Understanding the scope of that risk and the scale of that risk is really important. And then how do you bring in others and others in your organization? Because this risk will affect many different parts of your organization as well as your vendors. How do you bring them into that conversation and have it more data driven and more focused? So this is a key part, and we'd love to understand how that shapes and how that shows up currently in your organizations and what aspects of this would be most interesting to you. Moving to the next page. Once you do have the risk, and once you've isolated the risk, it's really important to understand whether you need to act on it or not. And how do you plan for it? And not all risks are the same, as I mentioned, and not all risks you need to act right away. Some risks you manage, you watch, and you see if it bubbles up. Others definitely cause for action. So how do you develop or use planning scenarios so that you're not caught waiting? And depending on how the risk reveals itself, you could potentially start taking steps to mitigate some of that risk. Maybe you start if there is a supplier risk and a lockdown in a region, for example, certain ports are shut down, or certain labor movements are struck, as many organizations expect, and many scientists expect the COVID situation to continue over the next few years. How do you manage and mitigate against that? When should you start acting? What are the best practices from peers? You're facing this right now. In fact, this period, a lot of organizations are experimenting on different actions, capturing that information and sharing that around so that you don't have to learn on your own, but learn from your leading peers is really important. And then most importantly, everything comes down to cost. How do you estimate the cost for each action? Yeah, how do you calculate the expected cost for each scenario? What's the impact to you? Those pieces are really important in making a decision and sharing it with your executives and your peer executives on what to do. All that could be potentially part of the solution. We'll have to understand what's important to you. The third one, going to smart sourcing and supplier vetting. Here what we see is, we've seen repeatedly, and Ben will talk a little bit more detail about this, is often in situations you're forced to take action around finding alternative suppliers, not for specific types of ingredients. Maybe your main supplier is providing a number of different products, but one or two may be damaged or have some challenges with. Maybe you want to have backups. Many organizations already have backups, but you may want to have additional backups for certain types of products and ingredients. So what do you do? How do you quickly find a short list? Typically brokers, distributors help you. But if everybody's facing the same thing, how do you do that quickly and smartly? So we have, and we'll talk specifically around some of the new products a lot of organizations are trying to understand and purchase right now in terms of PPE and how quickly we can supply that. It's not just finding a list, a name and address and a telephone number, but really important vetting the supplier at the level that gives you confidence that they can deliver. This is a lot, as Ben mentioned, these spot markets right now for a lot of products are causing, is often a gray market. There's people are overstretched, people are, there could be a fraud in there. How do you identify which supplier is valid, legit, their product is valid and legit, and which one should you work with? This could be done with data. Data allows us to, the data we have allows us to really tease out the reputation, the reliability, the history of delivering the product. And that's really given on the next page. Let's talk to this. So we've taken the list that Ben mentioned, the questions and it's not just a list coming from Ben. These are gleaned from conversations with clients, with vendors, with suppliers on the typical processes that they go through when vetting supplier. It takes months on average, and depending on the product, depending on the region you're dealing with, often it takes a trip over. It's a pretty expensive proposition. Because we believe that we can narrow down this list. The data we have will allow you to narrow down this list. So you're working with a much shorter vetted list. It's not taking months to come up with that list, but really hours and days. And this is something that is really important. We can accelerate that process. And most importantly, we monitor the same questions continuously. So it's not a one and done. Typically this process, because it's so arduous, people do it once and forget it. What happens if there's a huge management turnover in your organization that you miss? What happens when there's financial stability and the company goes strained, which is highly likely to happen in the next few months as bankruptcies across the world, across suppliers really take off? How do you monitor that? The data will allow you a continuous feed of data from our data sets will allow you to actually monitor and stay ahead of it. The next few pages really give you examples of how that interface will show up, and then we'll pull up specifically around some of this supplier sourcing, as there are a number of questions that have come up there. So actually, let's move to the next page. Here, this is a very simple view. It's a global view. It's really mapped onto the world. Your suppliers. And key transition points. So whenever goods change hands or are mapped into the map, we do this. You have information of your level ones. We do as well. We also are able to take it not just to the supplier name or the company name, but really to the manufacturing location or the facility. And this is really important because you could be transacting with the holding company in Ireland or in the Netherlands, but the product is being manufactured in a specific location here, for example, is in India, for example. How do you manage that? How do you know that the issues on the ground are going to affect your supply because your product is being produced in a specific area? So we map it down to that region. We often have information that a lot of our clients don't at that detail. And then you can monitor risks at that location. Moving to the next page. Give you a lot of detail around each of the alerts, not just the alert, but also the location. So very quickly here, you can look at the volume produced, the history of the volume produced, allowing you to understand how much that production location has capabilities to produce. So know that you're in range, you're out of range, and so on and so forth. Number of different clients that they have is really and that's really important because are you a sole supplier? Are you captive to them? Are you one of many? How do you rate amongst the big player, their big buyers versus small buyers? Because when things get strained, decisions get made, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of that decision. It's really that all should feed into your scenario planning that allows you to then look at the next page. To understand and isolate what's really important is where this risk is coming from and how often do they work together. As shown here is an example on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, once you do isolate the risk, then a key thing in getting suppliers and also comparing across your suppliers, because often you have multiples for certain products, comparing where the risk is. And where the risk is now versus later, how do you manage against it? Comparing each risk in isolation or in combination will help you get to a much more stable and much more effective scenario plan. That'll serve your organization and you well. Moving to the next page. And often, as we think about managing our vendors and vetting our vendors, what becomes really important is saying sometimes you need to go out and source for new products, new ingredients, and find new suppliers. And here I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben, in a second, but we've got a lot of requests now coming in for PPE suppliers, as you might imagine. So this is new. This is something that organizations hadn't really sourced in the past, but our database allows us to very quickly look through our list. So we have in food over 110,000 suppliers for different products globally, animal food as well, about 6,800. Medical devices, from which this list is pulled from, and this is only parts of the PPE, like surgical gloves here, but you can see the others that we have. 13,000 suppliers globally. There are actually more suppliers globally than there are suppliers in the US. So really allowing you to understand very quickly who are the vetted ones, who are not, who are they working with, who has capacity, who has inventory, allows you to sort of narrow down who to talk to. Let me turn it over to you, Ben, to shed some light as you are facing this daily and you're working with organizations to help them.
Yeah, thank you, Shub. So the slide that you're looking at here, this happens to be data that addresses a certain sort of slice of personal protection equipment suppliers that have exported to the United States and have gone through some evaluation of the FDA of some kind. You'll see on the top the product codes. Some of you might recognize those product codes. Those are FDA product codes that are used in FDA's data screening. Most of the time, companies are looking at, in fact, FDA even encourages them to look at, say, import alerts, look at FDA refusals. If you can get access to any inspection data that may exist from FDA or from other third-party, other countries, or even third parties, those are the kinds of things you're gonna look at. But what you often can only get is information that your supplier is providing to you, unless you're getting it from the FDA sources, which are open and more easily accessible. It turns out that FDA has, of course, the data available for FDA as well as customs and other agencies has the data available in order for us to see all of the shipments that a company would make. The ability to actually see what has happened over a period of time, what's happened before or after the presentation of an import alert. An import alert is a really good example of how the data that is available that's ordinarily relied upon is in some ways unreliable. Not that that it's inaccurate when you're reviewing it. It's that it could no longer be accurate if you viewed it yesterday. A lot of the data that the government has and makes available is data that is snapshot data. It's present current status, and consequently, if the status changes, then and you don't happen to go back and look again, then you're not going to be able to recognize or see that change. The other thing, an import alert's a great example, because you can go on an import alert and you can find that a company is not on an import alert and then gain some level of confidence from that. But what you will not be able to see is that the company was on import alert 3 months ago, and they happen not to be on import alert now. And so it is possible to aggregate that data and develop essentially, rather than taking snapshots and looking at images and pictures, you're able to look at the movie. You're able to look at the shot over time to see what has happened with that company related to its FDA compliance as the agency has actually engaged the product at the border. It's also true that that's only one lens through which you can view that data. You can view that data with multiple filters in order to assess, even in circumstances where the FDA perhaps hasn't actually interacted with the product because the agency considers it to be relatively low risk, and consequently it's not being examined or tested, released or detained or refused. You're not necessarily seeing that level of richness in the data. There still is other data that's available that's able to help you determine whether or not there may be a risk associated with the supplier. A good example of that is it's extremely rare for a supply chain to involve only a few nodes. It usually involves multiple nodes. Whether you're thinking about tier 2 or tier 3, or even multiple manufacturing sites taking part in the production of goods. Whether they are in the same country or in a different country. Well, those goods have to move around in order for that to occur. And so that kind of data is available in order to see whether or not the company is operating at a level that you would expect for them to be operating in compliance. And once changes occur in the supply chain, they could be based upon nothing more than a shutdown for the purposes of doing a regular scheduled cleaning of a facility, in a food facility. But it also could be that there's a recognized problem in that facility that has not yet become public, and then supplies are now being diverted from other manufacturers, whether they're contract or other facilities that are run or operated by the same entity. So all of these risks that arise ordinarily in supply chains. We're not talking about things that are necessarily anomalies. We're talking about ordinary course of business where there is risk associated with the product itself, or with the production of that product, the environment in which it's being made, the supply chains through which it's being shipped. It should be expected that there would be exceptions. And the question is, can you see those exceptions? Can you get access to the information in order to investigate those exceptions, and then make intelligent business decisions based upon the information that you can get from the data as well as the follow-up? Shub.
Yep, that's great. And then there was a question that came in around how does this work for even data poor supply chains or products where you tend not to have sufficient data. So what we have is, this is an example of it. We have it at the code level, at the product code level. And this is then linked, that product is then linked to shipments that have come across the borders all the way to the source, the manufacturing source. So we have an extremely rich data set that can augment your own internal data if needed, but doesn't necessarily need to. We work with organizations that just give us their supplier names and the product ingredients that they're looking at, and that's all that they share with us, and we map the rest out. So our risk, there were a few slides ago where you were talking about the different data sets. We were able to tie a very rich a global understanding around that product those ingredients all the way from, tracing it all the way from the manufacturing location to you, to wherever you're purchasing it in, and the port in the US, and give you the risk points all along the way. And this could be, this is just an example here for PPE because it's all the rage right now in the news. But now imagine you can do this for your food. For each of you, you're looking at specific, you're looking for a specific type of cheese, or you're looking at a very specific type of cheese is a perfect example because that came up recently, and that is produced only in a certain area, or the other suppliers in the world that has the same capability to do so. This allows you to narrow down that list very quickly, and then be able, working with us, we'd be able to then dig in and give you the additional details you need, tailor it to your specific request. And so where will this be of value? So moving to the next page, we see a tremendous amount of value in where organizations are approaching us, and we're helping them with really when you're looking at having conversations with your suppliers about your risk. So this COVID experience has raised this to a C-level, in fact, a boardroom level discussion right now, and it's top of mind. Talking to a client who the CEO every meeting talks about the food supply chain and the food safety risk that they face to kick off the meeting. This is a significantly important and really the well-being of an organization. So how do you have that conversation with suppliers and have it data-driven and focused around where the risk is? Or you're evaluating new suppliers. Things are changing these days, and you're looking at new suppliers, or in the normal course of business, you're adding new suppliers. How do you vet them smartly and quickly? And the third one on the right-hand side is if you are planning and preparing for an extended period of uncertainty, COVID or not, we have entered a period where the number of supply chain issues, the number of food safety issues, device safety issues has been increasing year over year. How do you prepare and plan for an extended period of uncertainty where you're not stuck being reactive, but you really get ahead of that issue, you're alerted in advance, and you have time to prepare and act? How do you get those pieces in? And that really is the future. We expect organizations that are able to do that well will be given that advantage, and will be able to source smartly and be able to lock up product and supplies for themselves in advance before others can. So really, this is we see where the world is going on that front. But we see this of value to you if you're in any of these three buckets, and we are asking your help and guidance, helping us prioritize what's really of importance to you, and where we should focus our data to create value back to you. So let me turn to you, Aisha, to give a little bit of detail on how we're doing that, and then we'll open up for questions.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so if you have questions, start to put them in the chat. We'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, which is great. But real quick, I want to let you know that to further develop and bring the platform that we've been showing you to market, we're going to use a model that's called co-creation. And this is where end users help advise from the development early on. It's a concept that's used with many, many companies, and has really been made famous by Lego. So I don't know about you, but I'm doing more Lego these days than I used to. But Lego has this great co-creation platform. It's called Ideas. You should definitely go to their website and check it out. But this is where Lego enthusiasts can post designs that they have for new play sets, along with the fully completed play set. And then they can also vote and give feedback on other submitted projects. And if a project receives over 10,000 votes, then it goes to a review phase and eventually could be brought to market. So our version of co-creation will be a little bit different. We are going to do this through a peer advisory group. And you can see the details here on the slide. But this is where members will have the chance to meet with each other and meet with other quality, safety, supply chain executives and share ideas, but also help guide the development. And participants will receive complimentary beta customer licenses and category exclusivity in exchange for participation. So we're kicking this group off in a few weeks on May 21st. And if you're interested, we'd love to speak further with you. So we're going to put up a quick poll here and give you a chance to maybe indicate if you'd like to participate. Again, it's going to be May 21st is our first kickoff meeting. And you can see the poll here. You'll get a chance, obviously, to speak with peers in a more intimate setting than what we had today, to share ideas, and then collaborate with us on the design, receive your complimentary beta license, and again, category exclusivity. So you should have the poll up now, and would love to know if you're interested in the peer advisory group. Also, if you'd like kind of more one-on-one time with either Ben or with Shub to help you with an immediate issue, please let us know as well. That's question number 2 that's up on the poll. So while we're doing the poll, I'm going to go back to the chat and see if we've got some questions. One that came in, I think we may have already answered, but the question is the compliance history from FDA, CBP, OGAs, that's public, correct?
Much of the information, this is Ben, much of the information that you saw just a snapshot of is publicly available. It just turns out it's in a format that is not very useful. so it does require a fair amount of 2 things. One is I wouldn't say there is some data edit that has to occur in some of that data in order to get it into a format that that makes some sense. And then secondly, there's a lot of interpretation of that data. There's a lot of there's a lot of understanding necessary behind the codes, behind the various activities. The data doesn't come as it's not available in one location. It actually comes from multiple sources and consequently has to be aggregated. It has to be integrated. Otherwise, you can't see the actual flow, for instance, of a shipment through the regulatory process. So the answer is, yeah, it is. The majority of it is publicly available. You're not going to find it on FDA's website anywhere. And you're not going to find it in that kind of a format.
Good, thank you. Any other questions? We've still got about 50 people on the line, so don't be shy. You can chat your question in.
Polling closed. Was that intentional?
Yep, polling was closed. Yeah. And if you have, oh, here we go. Is inspection data from other countries publicly reported?
Some of that data is publicly reported, is publicly available. It is one, it's not in the English language ordinarily. 2, it's usually reported out by the agency that did the work. In other words, it's not aggregated at the country level. So you would have to seek that information through that country's own, essentially like their FOI like program. There are some locations where you can get some data that's published on a semi-regular basis. It tends to be old data. It doesn't tend to be very current. So yes, it's out there. It's not the best source of information about what's happening in a facility with respect to inspections, but there is some data out there.
Great, thank you. Other questions? I always like to make sure I give a long enough pause, see if anyone else has a question. We certainly have a few more minutes left.
There was a question that came in about organizations trying to evaluate and assess the risk of their existing suppliers using our data. And that's absolutely possible. So that's something that we could do, and we do that on a regular basis for clients.
Good. And if you, I can't reopen the poll, but if you do want to be contacted by either Shub or Ben or talk more and get some assistance with the issues that you're facing at your organization, feel free to just chat me privately, and we'll make sure that that we get in touch with you. You can also see both Ben and Shub's contact information up on this slide as well. So certainly feel free to reach out to them. Will the material be shared with participants? Yes, we're happy to do that. So we'll send a follow-up with that information. Definitely happy to send that out as a follow-up. All right, well, I will give everyone about 5 minutes back on your calendar. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope this was useful. Best of luck to all of you. And again, please let us know if there's any way that we can be of assistance.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.